trying to consciously getting people to think about that. So we've thought about a new model for community learning and needing to identify key issues that affect individuals and their communities at both local and global levels, developing simple but robust approaches to researching these issues, developing understandings of context, producing first-step action plans to support individual and collective action, putting plans into action, and reviewing and reflecting upon the process. It's a kind of cycle of things that we're thinking about how people do. And for us, it's a kind of back to the future. It's some of the things that the WEA have often argued for and said about itself in the past. We haven't always been great at doing what we say, just the same as anybody else. But by and large, it's something that we're keen on. So things like action learning programs are really popular education techniques that we've used in the past, and they build interest and commitment by encouraging participants to develop their own confidence and skills. They often build upon a range of themes, encouraging people to have a go at information seeking and action for themselves. They think about whether it could be whether we could use those kinds of approaches to reform the model for teaching and learning in the WEA. And we started that discussion, Elaine and her colleagues, Rahana will know, a couple of years ago in the WEA in North West. And it's kind of took off. It's reinvigorated how our people think about teaching and learning across the association. I wouldn't say we're doing this in all of our classes now, but what we are doing is discussing it everywhere, and it's starting to become part of how we think that we should run our organisation. So it's becoming a part of a model for us. So whether we could develop thinking about whether we could develop a challenging curriculum, so sort of active critical learning in all of our courses, building a research and questioning culture and action culture. And if we did, whether that, and we're obviously conscious of this as an education organisation, whether that could become a unique selling point for the WEA, that when you come on a WEA course, that's what you get, not the sorts of stuff that you might, where you're being taught at in a college and the kind of Spanish courses that you've talked about and so on. So, which courses? History, we could do this. Politics, we could do this. Environmental science, we could do these kinds of things. Sociology, we could. Possibly, we could do that if we taught those courses. We do them actually, but a lot of them we don't. We don't do. What about art and craft? Or textiles and garment making? Or cookery, sugarcraft and cake making? These are the kinds of courses that we do, or flower arranging. These are the kinds of courses that we do in community venues up and down the country. They're the kinds of interest and leisure education that people are happy to come to. Quite often, by the way, it's pretty difficult. We've advertised sociology since we found out it wasn't available in Liverpool. I think we've advertised it for the last 2 years now, at each session adverts, and I think we've had 2 recruits so far. So sometimes people, the point that Clive was making, I think, about not necessarily wanting to engage with that sort of stuff anyway. There is a lack of a market in some areas of education, so we might want it, we might see the value of it, particularly in things like government and politics, but punters aren't turning up to sit on the seats to join in classes about them. Where they do is in things like this. And what we're interested in is how do these kinds of ideas about critical social learning work in community courses. I find it easier to think about it in some of the sort of more academic subjects, and more challenging to think about it. More challenging, but not impossible. So we're trying to do these kinds of things of action research approach in all of our classes, and it's perfectly likely that if you turn up to do a flower arranging course, you ain't expecting to do research, would be my guess. And it's difficult but for us it's kind of difficult to conceive of courses where students taking part in some research in the course is not useful. And I'm sort of thinking about it as our most useful approach. It promotes an active learning rather than receiving, so people have got to go out and find information, and they don't then start to think that the pearls of wisdom are just coming from the tutor. It promotes kind of new understandings by students and teachers. It challenges the students and teachers to action, and it often brings in things that are not what people expect. It helps us as teachers to challenge our own perceptions, and so we're trying to get people to go out there and to find things out as a result of the courses that we do. So we did things like themed art classes. We took our art classes, which, to be frank, at times involve somebody pitching up to do paintings, and we're often using other people's paintings to do a repeat of that in some of our classes. Sometimes they were painting images from postcards and something like that. They were quite quiet places What we did was to link it to the themes of the spirit level and ask people to go out in their communities and talk to people about inequality and how it was affecting them. So one of our classes started to look at things like the regeneration programs in Salford, and was sort of looking at before and after and using that as ideas around equality. Now, I was talking to one of our organisers today who was doing a sugarcraft course, and they're doing sugarcraft is getting sugar and turning it into nice pretty things on the top of cakes. And they were doing things around doing the sugarcraft, so they were learning how to do it, which is what they wanted to do, but they were also linking in, what they started to do was use the colours of flowers and the bees to do stuff about the environmental campaign. Some of you will know that there is a campaign to try and save the bumblebee as a key constituent of the English environment, as it were. And we were just getting them involved in thinking about that. So they come to do sugarcraft, they weren't expecting to talk about the environment. Cake making cultures, when we do cake making courses, we've sort of used the difference between cakes in different cultures as a way of exploring what those cultures are. What do they signify and say about us and our cultures? And can they help us explore difference? So we've got people sort of thinking about things and going out and finding out what do other people do that for? What sort of ingredients do they use? What events do they do? So it's starting off with quite simple bits of research and discovery exercises that take us into another area. Oh, my battery's low. I don't want that really. Okay. We also start to try and think about broader contexts in classes and students linking their knowledge to other contexts as a key objective for tutors. We want to sort of broaden the discussion frame and challenge assumptions and stereotypes and back up and generate and regenerate sorts of items for research. Again, we were sort of thinking about, we used a garment making class in Rochdale where we got a community of mostly Pakistani origin. And we were linking work there with discussing and understanding the rag trade more broadly. So thinking about why the rag trade had been once the centre of places like Rochdale, and why Rochdale was completely important to it, and how it had now, contradictorily enough, shifted to places like Pakistan at the time that while over the same time, some people had moved in the opposite direction to those very places, and just kind of exploring some of that idea. We were thinking about flower arranging and its links to the African flower economy, not the lengths of the courses, but how flowers are done around that, and how it might impact upon Manchester, and how we think about why flowers are not food in places like Africa. So we were starting to talk about that. We did a cycling course for Muslim women, which they then used to start to think about what was happening with cycling and women in other countries, and where cycling was broadly a leisure activity here, but was overwhelmingly a transport issue in a whole range of countries, and it led to our group starting to raise a whole range of funds for a particular village in Uganda, where they subsequently went out and did some of some work around water and environmental development in those areas as a result of doing cycling. We've used the co-op in a number of examples, from banners to healthy food, to explore issues and link it to ideas around a self-help movement. It's a Greater Manchester born and bred worldwide movement that has a number of really interesting features around it. We've kind of introduced people to that and said, why do you think people did that? Why did they get together? And that sort of stuff as a process for taking us through. We've got this kind of other thing that I'm trying to do, and I have to admit that I've not yet cracked this. But what we also try to do is to get kind of activity as a key learning tool in our classes. Not just coming into the class, but doing something as a result of it. So as a class, undertaking an activity or an action. So getting the teachers and students to work together to create a small amount of change in their communities, and trying to solidify the learning experiences. My view is that I learned how to do an awful lot of things, not actually by being taught them, but by doing them, and particularly around sort of engagement in a more political and community activity. You just did it, and that you look now. Some way we've got to get people thinking about being engaged in that process again. And it seems to me that our courses can do that. But most importantly, as an educator, it's a fabulous, fabulous learning experience at which you can use to start to think about, well, what were the experience, what were the lessons of it, how do we build upon it, what did you find out, what did it show you about people's reactions to the things that we're saying, and so on. Moving people from passive to active citizens, and obviously sort of developing the confidence of the group as it develops. We've said doing nothing should not really be an option, and the point of the course is to encourage and enable people to take the first step in engaging at community level, however modest that might be. So working together to create or change something relating to the key issues with decision makers or with services, with service users, with community members, with community institutions. And we see it as things like obvious campaigning stuff, but not just that. We see it as things like performance and photography and film, art and story writing, and sort of more imaginative approaches to doing things within the community, not necessarily doing something else. So on our art course, for example, we got them to engage with the local councillor and show their artwork. It was the first time they'd met the councillor. It was the first time the councillor had heard about the WEA. It was the first time the councillor had ever heard about the spirit level, and it was the first time that they'd sort of engaged in those kinds of those discussions. So a learning experience both ways, and that for me is something really important as well. And then finally, we believe in this idea of looking back on what we've done, thinking about reflecting and refining it, learning from each other, and getting things, learning from our mistakes, not assuming that we're going to get it right. So the activity and action needs to be reviewed, and we then need to build it into a new cycle of research, thinking about the context, thinking about the activities, refinement. So we've applied it to a range of WEA classes, some of which I've mentioned, the things like the spirit level class. We did the Ragged Trouser Philanthropists and a study of the book, and used that as some areas to do. We tried to We tried to develop some learning circles, because what we're interested in is, we don't think we've got the resources to do this in our talk, but what we need is people to develop learning discussions in places such as this, or in community venues. And we thought about mechanisms of doing that, like some having resources that allow people with a bit of training to lead a discussion more along the types of lines that I think we would normally want to do with a more sort of thought